Jeff, is that a lapel mic back there?
Yeah. What you looking for?
The lapel mic?
Oh,
Yeah.
see if it's on where both snap. I doubt he took it with him. He set it up there with vibrations. I have another lapel mic that we can mic it with the battery
I'm
up.
not seeing it up here.
And you look underneath.
Yeah, I better check, huh?
Wow.
That won't be a problem for us here. It's just the people trying to hear the recording might have a hard time.
Yeah.
So,
Oh,
found it? All right. Just coming through for
yeah,
us.
back to back. He was disguised among the wires.
Okay. All right. Good morning. And if we're past that fiasco, everything should be smooth sailing from here on out. It's been a little while. Some of you may have forgotten what we were studying. We're going through the genealogy of Jesus, as we have recorded in Luke chapter 3 and Matthew chapter 1. And to kind of bring us back to what we were doing, so we kind of all are caught up here on what we're trying to accomplish here, is one, trying to understand God's plan for man. And we spent a lot of time when we talked about God and Adam and their relationship and really seeing how God had a plan for sin. Even though this was something that was terrible, it separated man from God, it required reconciliation, but God had a plan for reconciliation. And even Bo, when he was here this last week, talking about the conversions in Acts, he's constantly describing that as this is God's plan for man. This is reconciliation. The Bible, in summation, is God's plan of reconciliation with mankind. That is a great oversimplification, perhaps, but that is the main point here, is how do we get from separation from God to reunification with God? And by going through this genealogy, we can see all along the way, God is hinting at there's going to be something coming. There's going to be this one who's going to be here. We've already seen that in Genesis chapter 3. We're going to see more of it, and we're going to constantly see it, and that's kind of the point. God is going to make it so that we don't have an excuse. We can see the evidence, we can see the information, we can see the plan, and now that we have the complete Bible for us today, we can see how it all comes together without wondering like, well, did he really send Jesus? Like, it's all here. It's all very plain. And by going through these people, we can see not just a spiritual plan, but we can see a historical record here. These are not just random, made-up, fictional people. These are real people. These are real times. These are real events. This is how God made his plan unfold. And we can see that through all these eras that we're going to be going through. We haven't gone very far, but we're going to continue to kind of see how God's hand was there throughout all of these generations. So we've gone, basically we were starting from God and Adam, and we're going to work our way all the way down to Jesus eventually. We're not anywhere close to there yet because we've had a great amount to talk about, which is great. So if you have comments, thoughts, questions, don't hesitate to bring them up. That's the purpose of this class, is we can kind of learn and talk about things together. There will be some things I don't necessarily consider, but if you bring it up, maybe I'll be like, oh yeah, that's a great thought, or here's how we can look more into that. I'm trying not to get too much aside onto other tangents as much as possible. I'm trying to keep somewhat of a narrow focus, but if things come up in discussion, we definitely want to address them. So go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 5. That's kind of where we're going to begin today. 2 weeks ago, we ended on Methuselah, the oldest man recorded in Scripture. That's kind of his biggest claim to fame. Just for a recap on Methuselah real quick, aside from being very, very old by the time he dies at a very interesting moment, and it's not exactly clear because it depends on how you count the years. He either dies the year before the flood or the year of the flood, which if that's the case, then he may have died in the flood. We don't know exactly how close he comes to that time, but it's very close. We're not given specific indicators on that. It is just perhaps an interesting coincidence or not. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. We'll actually talk about Methuselah a little bit when we talk about Lamech in just a minute. So Lamech is actually the next one we have on our list. And when we're going through the genealogies of the New Testament, we would see Lamech appear in Luke chapter 3, verse 36. Again, Luke, he starts with Jesus and works his way backwards from Jesus all the way back to Adam and then God, whereas Matthew starts from Abraham and works his way down to Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. So we haven't even gotten to the people in Matthew chapter 1 yet until we get to Abraham, and we've already talked about why they are different in that way. So I'm not going to get back into that. But let's talk about Lamech. If you're there in Genesis chapter 5, some of these verses I'm just going to refer to. I'm not going to read through all of it, just to kind of save us time. But there will be some verses that we'll read over the course of today. So first of all, Lamech here in Genesis chapter 5, this is not to be confused with the other Lamech that came before him. And you say, well, there's no other Lamech in this genealogy. Well, you're right, sort of. There is a Lamech who is the great-great-great-grandson of Cain. Back in Genesis chapter 4, it talks about him, verses 17 through 24. That's a different Lamech. It's kind of it's like Enoch. We think of Enoch as the one who's in Genesis chapter 5 and is mentioned kind of briefly in Jude and in Hebrews chapter 11. But there was also a different Enoch that came before him who was the son of Cain. Cain has his own lineage. They're stealing names. They're not that creative. I don't know what to tell you. Please don't get confused. They just happen to have the same name. So this is different Lamech here. Not a descendant of Cain. This is the descendant of Seth. So this Lamech is the son of Methuselah. That's Genesis chapter 5, verse 25, where we see that. When we get to Genesis chapter 5, verse 30, it says that Lamech had other sons and daughters. Now, this is something we've seen throughout Genesis chapter 5 as we've been going through those generations. They had other sons and daughters, but we only get one that's named. And for this one, we name his son Noah. Lamech was 182 years old when Noah was born. We see that in Genesis chapter 28 Genesis chapter 5, verses 20 through 29. Now, there's not really a lot said about Lamech, really, except for the things that have to do with Noah. I think maybe the most interesting thing about Lamech is why he chooses Noah's name. You may not have really thought about this or be like, oh, it's just a detail. But the Bible doesn't just list details for fun. We come to find that out. When there's a detail given, it's something worth pondering over just a little bit. And we may not find the answer to it this morning, but I think we should think about it. In Genesis chapter 5, verse 29, Lamech says of Noah that, quote, he will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed. Okay? So Noah's name sounds similar to the Hebrew word for comfort or peace or rest. So that's why he gives him that name, or at least that's why he says. Now, we do know that God had indeed cursed the ground. This is not actually new information. If you go back to the fall of man, Genesis chapter 3, verses 17 through 19, he actually talks about, actually, can someone go and read that so that we all kind of know what's being talked about here? Someone read for us Genesis chapter 3, verses 17 through 19, please.
Then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake, in toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return.
Okay, thank you. So I think this is partly what is being referenced here is this curse. Now, what's so interesting about this is Genesis chapter 3 only, it feels like it's only a couple chapters ago, but there's a huge amount of time that has passed between chapters 3 and this latter part of chapter 5. We're talking hundreds of years. Several generations have gone by. If you want to do the math, go ahead. I haven't calculated it in my head yet for you. So this is not new information. This is not something that just happened in Lamech's lifetime. This was a long time ago that God stated this curse in Genesis chapter 3 during the time of Adam. We're a long way removed from that time-wise. So it kind of makes us wonder, why is Lamech making this point with Noah's name so many generations later? Why, of all people, Lamech, and why, of all times, this time is this, we're going to name him Noah because of this curse? So I'm going to give you a couple thoughts that I had, and then I want to see if you guys have any ideas. We'll kind of bounce ideas off of each other here. And I'm going to go with some maybe less serious ones, but ones that are talked about by commentators. Some say that Lamech was just tired of the subsistence farming and just wanted Noah to do it for him. I don't think that's quite what he's talking about. That seems a little bit shallow to me. And we don't know this for sure, but we can perhaps surmise, had the curse of the ground gotten worse as mankind increased in wickedness? This is something I'll probably talk about again as we talk about Noah. There has been a decline in man's relationship with God even since Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3, we see the fall of man. There's a separation because of sin. And when you see the next generation, we've Cain and Abel. They're offering sacrifices of various quality, but they are offering sacrifices. There is a desire to serve God in some capacity, even though Cain doesn't do it right and continues to not do it right, and that becomes a problem for him. In the time of Enosh, not Enoch, in Enosh's time, it talks about men calling on the name of the Lord in that time, which we kind of talked about that phrase several weeks ago. Pardon me. Kind of this idea that there was a desire to seek and serve the Lord, but perhaps an ignorance or not a full knowledge of the Lord at that point. It didn't have that relationship like Adam had that relationship with God. They were seeking God, they were calling on his name, but they were removed from God a certain distance, perhaps more so than Adam and perhaps more so than the generations before them. By the time we get to Enoch, we see that Enoch is prophesying against the generation of which he is existing. Jude talks about this probably in the most detail. Hebrews 11 kind of touches on it just a little bit. But Enoch was saying, hey, you're doing wrong here. And Enoch is very much different from the rest of his generation. God pulls him from the earth. He does not experience death. Hebrews 11 talks about that in the same way that any other person would have experienced death in those days. Elijah being probably the only other similar example, and even that might be a little different. It's one of those things we don't know a lot about. So could it be that the curse of the ground gets worse because man's wickedness is getting worse? That's a thought. Or did Lamech have some sort of divine inspiration from God? Was he prophesying that Noah was going to provide some kind of deliverance? Maybe one that he didn't fully understand. This happens all the time when prophets will prophesy something that is beyond their time, beyond their knowledge, but God has a plan in there for him. Now, the reason I bring this one up is not just because, yes, we know Noah definitely did bring a deliverance to mankind. We're going to talk about that when we talk about Noah in just a minute. But let's jump ahead just a little bit. Someone turn to Genesis chapter 8 and read verses 21 through 22. And remember, Lamech back here in Genesis chapter 5 is talking about the curse of the ground. So keep that in mind as we go through this. Whoever's there, Genesis chapter 8, verses 21 and 22, please.
And the Lord smelled the soothing aroma. Then the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease.
Okay. So we see this similar phrase that God says here in verse 21. He says, never again will I curse the ground because of man, even though every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood. And he kind of goes on and talks about his promise of not sending another flood. Now this, for context, this is after the flood has happened. Noah and his family, they've come off the ark. God is giving his promises to them. There's going to be more of that we'll talk about with Noah. But is perhaps this what Lamech is talking about in regards to what he's saying here back in Genesis chapter 5? Was this verse 30 where we're at? I'm sorry, verse 29. Verse 29. I don't know. It's just extremely similar language. And so I wonder if perhaps Lamech, whether he understands this fully or not, has some sort of inspiration from God to say these things about Noah. Thoughts, comments, anything that you guys have? Jeff, did you throw your hand up? You were first, so.
Are we trying to say here that this ended the curse that God put in Genesis 3?
So that's another thing to think about, and I haven't totally wrapped my head around that either, because if you say that, that curse has ended, hey, we shouldn't have weeds anymore. That's how a lot of us would take that, and we wish that was the case. Huh?
By curse here, does he mean sin, which the flood did eliminate, except for, I know Noah was not perfect, but he was forgiven. He was righteous before God. He offered sacrifices and was atoned. So maybe that's the curse here is sin.
I think maybe we can interpret this curse as a total destruction, perhaps, because it seems to be contextualized within that. If we're talking about the flood, never again will I curse the ground because of the sin. Never again will I destroy the creation.
Destruction itself, not sin.
Perhaps, and that's the thing is we're not given. We always we want more information. Like, what is he talking about with this? Which is why I'm trying to use as much context clues as possible. So, are all these things, Genesis 3, Genesis 5, and Genesis 6, all talking about the same thing? Or is Genesis 5 referring to Genesis 3, which is different from Genesis 6? That's the question, I guess, we're looking to answer. Go ahead, ma'am.
Well, it was very characteristic of Paul's writing in the New Testament that he said over and over again, I would have you to remember, I will have you to recall.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is critical information that God is wanting, especially with the sin of the world, there being that evil there, to remind them, be it through Lamech or even another one, that it's critical. The curse was for the evil. He's re-emphasizing that.
Yeah, and I guess in looking at it that way, we can say that the curse is a consequence of the sin, in a way. In Genesis chapter 3, the curse of the ground in Adam's time was the consequence of their sin at that moment. The curse that perhaps Lamech and maybe God is referring to later in Genesis chapter 6. Am I saying chapter 6? I mean chapter 8. I keep saying chapter 6. That's not what I mean. I mean chapter 8. Sorry, I'm getting mixed up on numbers. Perhaps maybe saying, never again am I going to curse the ground because of man's sin. That's not going to be a factor in there, perhaps. But remember, this is what happened because of man's sin.
You said it better.
Okay. I hope so. I'm not sure what I said, but I think I'm there with you. I definitely see that as a very good way of looking at that. Again, I don't really have a great answer for this. I'm just putting out the ideas here and kind of seeing what makes the most sense within the context.
And you know, Jehovah has said, come and let us reason together. So with the evil increasing in the world like it did during this time, be it from Genesis 5 to chapter 8, it's a reiteration of the criticalness and the consequence of sin.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about knowing the consequence of sin, that's a reason why sacrifices were being made. These animal sacrifices all along the way was, here's the consequence of sin. It is death. James makes that very clear when he writes, sin leads to temptation when it's full grown or when it's manifested. It leads to death. That is the ultimate end. And if Jesus does not sacrifice himself on our behalf, that's our doom. Like, there's no other hope for us at that point. But of course, Jesus hadn't come yet in their time, so he's giving them a symbol of this is your consequence of your sin. Hopefully, I think I'm saying that right for you. I think I saw another hand next to you. Go ahead.
Us being able to have hindsight, would you
And just to detail on that, God did not say he would never again destroy the earth. He said he would never destroy it again by these floodwaters. There's going to be a final destruction, but it's not going to be like this. And I guess maybe there's sometimes debate about that. I don't really understand the debate, but it's not going to be like this again. We're not going to have an event like this. This is a one in a ever happening. I was about to say once in a lifetime, but it's more than that. That's just the phrase we use. Go ahead, sir. I saw your hand up there next.
Jeff mentioned a second ago about weeds. We don't know what the curse of the ground was. When God cursed the ground for man's sake, we don't know what that was. I'm sure it had something to do with weeds and thorns and thistles, but we really don't know. There's a lot of stuff that God could have done to make it really hard on man.
Well, we do get a little bit of perhaps some clues about it, the way it's described back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 18 of chapter 3, talking about the ground. God says, it will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat food until you return to the ground, indicating that he's going to have to work for it. It's not going to just come up. Like I think it's in contrast perhaps to the garden situation where God had planted this garden. Everything was great. Adam would tend to it, but it seems like when you get to this curse, it's going to be way, way more work now, Adam. You're really going to have to work for your survival.
And that's
Yeah.
one of the things I was going to say. Before the flood, of course, you talked about man's sin. Man's sin got increasingly worse. Whether or not that curse got increasingly worse or not, we don't know. It could have. God could have made it increasingly hard on men. And that's what happened in Egypt. Pharaoh made it increasingly hard on the children of Israel to create the bricks that they needed to create the buildings and stuff. We just don't know. But the thing is with the flood washed away all the sins of the world, all the worldliness, all of mankind except for Noah and his family. And it was really almost like a new beginning. It wasn't a new Garden of Eden. That's not what I'm saying at all. But it was like a new beginning. Sin had been washed from the world, and now Noah had found favor in God's eyes. That's not to say he didn't sin. He did, I'm sure. But it was a time where man could start to worship God again like God wanted them to. And they had the choice to do that.
Yeah, and we'll talk about kind of that fresh start, I think, more when we talk about Noah. I don't want to get too far ahead because I'm not there yet. But no, the point is taken there. Yeah, absolutely.
And so in that situation, the curse that he's talked about from Genesis chapter 3, that curse on the ground, it could have been lessened. It could have been taken away because of this new beginning. That's not to say that he's not going to have to work for the food that he's going to do, but it may be like today, my grandfather gardened until he was 85 years old. They had a garden, and yes, he would sweat when he would go out there and do it. But even an old man could go out there and do it without much trouble. We don't know how bad it was prior to the flood.
Yeah.
It could have been much, much, much worse.
And we've kind of talked about this a little bit before, is how little we really do know about the pre-flood world. Really, except for descriptions about the creation, the fall of man, we get so little detail between that point in Genesis chapter 3 and really the flood and the details of the flood. That whole era is, I'm not going to say erased from history because obviously we have the record here, but we're given so little information about it. And I think that's intentional. I think I'm guessing it. I'm trying to guess the mind of God, which is dangerous to do. It's easy for man to romanticize a history, even if that history is not necessarily good. Hopefully you all kind of know what I'm talking about. I think that is part of the reason we don't see a lot of those things. And God does not desire us to be like that world. So perhaps maybe the less about it we know, the less bad ideas we'll get. I'm not sure. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit more. But there have been these ideas of, maybe there was this ancient writing that somehow survived the flood, and such and such person way down the line got secret information from the pre-flood era, and they learned how to do certain things. we don't see any of that in Bible record. That's not substantiated anywhere. In fact, it would go against a lot of what Scripture says about the world being totally destroyed. That's how the New Testament describes it. The world was completely destroyed. Everything. When we did our Genesis 10 study, gosh, this is years ago, this is one of the things that I kind of talked about is the world that Noah stepped off the ark into was probably not quite the same earth that was around before that. Any of you who have studied geology and how water, especially a lot of water in a very short amount of time, can change a landscape, that explains a lot of things that we might see on the earth today. I won't get too much into that. I'm getting ahead of myself. Any other thoughts on Lamech before I turn away from him? Go ahead.
Well, and the truth of the matter is, we still have the thistles and thorns. And be it man or woman, there's still the sweat of the brow, that is still evident because evil exists.
And perhaps it's there to remind us about our sin. So, yeah, I think these are all good thoughts. And sometimes I'm trying to connect things that maybe are not necessarily connected. But when we see wording like this used that is very similar in these contexts, it's always interesting to kind of look at, is this what was being talked about? Because sometimes, more often than not, there is some sort of connection there. I just don't know exactly how to place it. I was spending a whole lot of time trying to figure it out, and I didn't want to hurt myself too bad. So I had to get up this morning. Jeff, you had a hand up? Or?
I was just going to say
Okay.
that the pain of childbirth has not changed.
Yeah.
I think that this is, you keep this in the context of the chapter it's in, it seems to be referring to the destruction of the flood and God's intention to remake the world. And you mentioned that God's not going to do that again. In the future, it will be done not just by fire, but it will be destroyed.
It will be totally complete.
It will not be made over and come back. It will be totally done away with.
Yeah. All right.
Won't be by warriors.
No, that's right.
Any other comments on Lamech? All right, let me give one final detail on him before we move on. One thing I did want to point out, Lamech, he only ends up living a total of 777 years, which sounds like a really long time to us. But if you go back and look at the people before him, he is significantly a shorter lifespan than anyone else. Why that is, I don't know. We're not given any reason to why that may be. Even his father, Methuselah, outlives Lamech another 5 years. So Lamech is dead before the flood. Now, I don't know what to pull from that. Just an interesting detail, and I'm going to leave it at that. Because, again, I'll just be going into supposition territory, and I don't want to do that too much. So if there's nothing else about Lamech, I'm going to move on to Noah. And I'm looking at the clock now, and I'm not going to finish Noah, because I have a lot more to talk about with Noah for reasons. So we're going to start Noah, and we'll probably have to finish it next week, but let's at least get into it. Noah is, of course, listed in the genealogy of Christ in Luke chapter 3, verse 36. He is the son of Lamech, as we've talked about back in Genesis 5, verses 28 and 29. The only descendants of Noah that are mentioned are his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, in Genesis chapter 5, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier with Lamech, all of the generations, it says of them, they had so-and-so as a son, and they had other sons and daughters. You always see that phrase, they had other sons and daughters, they had other sons and daughters, and just names one of the sons. We don't see that phrase used with Noah. Nowhere does it say Noah had Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and he had other sons and daughters. It doesn't say that. So I'm inclined to believe that he only had those three sons. It was not like these other generations before. It names three of his sons, which is kind of a difference from the previous generations, but we'll see why. But I'm going to go with the assumption that Noah only has three sons. And if I'm wrong about that, somebody point that out to me before I look foolish. Go ahead, James. You find where I'm wrong?
No.
Oh, okay.
Rare.
Oh, well.
If you go to Genesis chapter 9, verse 19, the Bible says, these three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole world was populated. Just to back up.
In regards to that, I don't think he had other descendants, things, because we literally don't know anything about them except that they existed. Anything we say about that is really guessing. Now, when we look at Genesis chapter 5, verse 32, it states that Noah was 500 years old by the time he had these three sons. The way I read that and the way I'm going to interpret it, unless someone has a better idea of it, is I'm going to assume that means by the time his youngest son was born, he was 500 years old. So we know that Ham is the youngest, which, if I'm doing the math correctly, Noah is 500 years older than Ham, and his older sons, Shem and Japheth, are somewhere in there in the middle. That's how I'm reading that. If anyone has a different translation that maybe words that a little differently that would cause us to believe something else, speak up, because that's kind of how I'm going to go with this moving forward. So it's not stating, it's different from the others in Genesis chapter 5 for that reason also. It talks about by the time he has 3 sons, this is how old he was, not when his firstborn he was this old, or when he had a secondborn he was this old. It just talks about by the time he was 500 years old, he had these 3 sons. And so I'm assuming that means he was 500 years old when Ham was born. That might be an assumption, but I don't think that's going too far off left field. Now, I want to just talk about his sons just for a second, as far as who they are. We get information about them later in Genesis chapter 9, verse 24, and Genesis chapter 10, verse 21. The way that it's generally accepted is that Japheth is the oldest, Shem is the next oldest, and Ham we pretty much know for sure by its description in Genesis 9, verse 24, that he is the youngest. He is called the youngest. Now, when you look at Genesis chapter 10 to verse 21, translations will differ a little bit on how it's worded. Some of them will make it sound like Japheth is the oldest. Some of them will make it sound like Shem is the oldest. More scholars than not will tend to think that Japheth is the oldest. That's the way it should be worded. Some of your translations may word it slightly differently. That's the way I'm going to assume it, because I'm not a scholar. I can't interpret it very well. Linguistics is not my forte. That's the assumption I'm going with. For the sake of this study, it doesn't really matter. It's just a detail. But as long as we all know that Ham is the youngest, I guess that's all that matters. Now, any comments on that before I kind of move on to chapter 6? I'm going to get into chapter 6 territory about the flood here in a second. Okay. When I get into chapter 6 here and talking about the flood, there's a lot of details I'm going to leave out. I'm trying to keep my scope on Noah and just talking about a little bit of the time period in which he was in, why he stands out. So there's going to be a lot of details about the flood I'm not really going to get into. If you want to, you can bring it up. But when I kind of skip over some things, I'm doing that on purpose to try to move things along, because all of you who were with us in the Genesis 10 study knew I spent several months talking about this, and that was before we actually got to Genesis 10. So I'm going to try to keep it brief as much as I can, but there are a lot of things we do need to talk about that are important regarding Noah and his place in this genealogy. So by the time we get to Genesis chapter 6, it's very clear that mankind has reached its lowest point. And I'm going to say lowest point in history ever. That's kind of the description we see. Again, sin entered the world through Adam. Sacrifices of various quality were being made in the next generation. Those in the time of Enosh were calling on the name of the Lord. Again, there's a desire to serve, perhaps not a full understanding. Then we see with Enoch, he's prophesying against those of his generation. Lamech, who we just talked about, he hopes for rest and peace, perhaps being delivered through Noah in his time, for reasons that we have kind of been talking about. And then we get here in Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 through 7. God has seen the great evil of man, and he's very sorrowful about it. I'm going to read this section just real quick. Genesis 6, 5 through 7 says, "The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. So the Lord said, I will wipe mankind, whom I have created, from the face of the earth, men and animals and creatures that move along the ground, and also birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them." Probably, I think those of you who know me, anytime we talk about a bad time in history, this is the one I always like to bring up. Like, this is an understatement. This is the worst time of man's history. Every inclination of every man's heart was only evil. All that are so bad now. If only they could have been like, back in our day when things were so good. Today may be bad. It's not this bad. The closest thing I might even use as a parallel to this time is we look at the example of the city of Sodom, where not even 10 righteous people could be found in the whole city. And that city was destroyed. And Those of you who are with us in our Abraham study know that maybe Lot was perhaps the only righteous man. Debatable, but he's the only one who really gets out of there. I guess him and his daughters, but that's it. The wife doesn't make it all the way. But even then, there's a whole bunch of suffering. It's really bad. But imagine Sodom, but it's the whole world. That's kind of the way I can think of it. Just scale it up to the entire earth is like Sodom. That sounds pretty bad. And even here in the entire world, not 10 people are found righteous. Only 8 people are on the ark. So just let that fester in your mind, and then you can be grateful for the time period in which you live. It's not that bad. It's not like this. This is really bad. And so I don't really blame God for being sorrowful about what has happened, about his creation. It's to the point here that only Noah and his family are going to be the ones spared this judgment that God is going to have with the flood here. It's really, really bad. All right. Now, there's more things about chapter 6 we can talk about. I'm going to kind of not go too much into it. I'm going to move on to chapter... No, I'm not. I'm out of time. I was going to go on to chapter 7 and start talking about stuff in there. So let me stop there, chapter 6. Any other thoughts, comments? Again, there's more about chapter 6 I could talk about, but that's kind of the main point I want to get at, is Noah and his family are kind of the standouts in a world of complete evil. Thoughts, comments, questions before we close this morning? This is kind of the best point I could stop. I could go on chapter 7, but I've got way more. I don't have the time for it. So, okay, we're going to stop there. Next week, we're going to pick up and begin again kind of here in Noah. So don't forget about Noah, please. I don't want to have to write back all the things we've talked about. We're going to move on, talk about things that go on through chapter 7 up through chapter 9. Maybe talk about chapter 10 just a little bit. We're going to really get more into that with Shem. And before we move on from Noah and talk about Shem, one thing I am going to talk about, hopefully next week, is how the New Testament talks about Noah. Because the New Testament refers to Noah, the flood, the ark, in very important ways I think we should talk about, I think are really important for this study. So I'm not going to just get to Genesis chapter 9 and then move on to Shem. I do want to kind of sit and talk about how Hebrews talks about Noah, how Peter talks about Noah. They're really important details I think we need to consider. So I'm going to pick up chapter 7. We're going to go through that. Maybe we'll finish Noah next week. If not, great. That means we had a lot of good stuff to talk about, but then we'll kind of move on after that. So I thank you for your comment.
Was great in the earth, and that every intent and thoughts of his heart was evil continuously. Then you go to Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9. The Bible tells us that the heart of man is very deceitful. And just like we were covering over in Genesis chapter 8, starting in verse 21. Genesis chapter 8, starting in verse. Bottom line is that what I'm trying to say is that the heart of man is the thing that God knows the best. You can fool everybody, but you can't fool God. And if the heart of man has always been deceitful, it makes you kind of afraid of this animal. There's no telling what this man can do to other men. It's sad and it's scary and it's true.
And I think maybe what we can pull from that, and this probably relates to Noah's generation in a lot of ways, is when man is separated from God and has no relationship with God, well, what moral code is there? That's sort of, there isn't one. I mean, let's say it that way. Without God, there is no moral code. You can have social contracts, you can have societal constructs, but if every man in his heart only intends to do evil, those things aren't going to last. It's chaos. I cannot imagine what Noah may have gone through before the flood. We think the flood is, a terrible thing. It would have been worse perhaps without the flood. I think the same way of Lot. Lot went through a lot of really bad stuff with Sodom, getting out of Sodom, but would it have been worse if he had stayed there in that condition? I think the New Testament kind of implies that. Talks about him being a righteous man who is tormented daily by the men of Sodom. So this sounds bad and all, and we look at men's hearts. Jesus, when he comes to the earth in his time and is doing his ministry, is constantly talking about the heart. Because what good is your action if your heart is not devoted to God? Oh, sure, you may offer those sacrifices. You may go through the motions, but you don't have that relationship to God if you're just doing it for the sake of doing it. That's a whole nother lesson. It's a great point, though. That doesn't exist in Noah's time. It's gone.
Well, just a final point, Ecclesiastes, the first chapter, specifically verse 14, says, I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of the spirit. So that's to follow the good gentleman's thoughts there,
And-
for us to consider.
And I love Ecclesiastes because he gives us all these things, and we're like, well, what's the point of anything, really? You read all of Ecclesiastes, and until you get to the really last couple verses, you're like, well, let me throw my hands up and just be done with it, because there's no point in doing anything. And he says, here is the whole duty of man, to serve the Lord, in essence. I mean, he says it a little bit better than that. I can't remember word for word, but that's the point. That's everything. And you don't have that, you don't have anything. And that's two ways of saying the same thing, I guess. All of that was absent in Noah's generation. We'll talk more about it perhaps next week, but it gives me a little bit of gratefulness that despite all the troubles we have in our time, despite all the things that seem to be going wrong and the trials we have, it ain't Noah's time in Genesis chapter 6. So have a little hope out there. It's worth doing God's work still. It ain't that bad, not yet. So hopefully that ends us on sort of a high note. Maybe not, but we're going to stop there. We'll move on to chapter 7 next week. Appreciate all your thoughts and comments.